Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Before getting into today's video, I would just like to take a moment to issue a correction. I spoke off the cuff last week when I said that most of the world is hungry. I didn't look into it, it's just one of those things that I knew was true. One of those factoids that you hear somewhere, it sounds plausible, and you never really question it. These things are all over the place, and I usually try and filter them out, but unfortunately this time I failed. My bad, I apologize. It's actually more like 10% of the world is hungry. Thank you all for correcting me. Now on to the next video. Today I've headed back to the Creation Training Initiative and its president, Mike Riddle. They have a 5-part series called The Evidence for the Existence of God. Hopefully they actually provide some, but I have my doubts. Let's go!
At the end of our lives, we're all going to face death. At that time, we will either face God or we will face nothingness.
Or reincarnation, or universal consciousness, or we become part of the life stream and help fight off the evil of meteor. My point is, that was a false dichotomy. There are many beliefs about what happens when we die that do not involve nothingness or meeting a god.
The fact that we're all going to die is not some subjective personal preference, but rather an objective truth. Therefore, it should concern us ahead of time to know which one is true. Either we will face God or we will face nothingness.
Well, all evidence points to nothingness, but again, those aren't the only two options. Is your evidence just going to be Pascal's wager? Because Pascal's wager depends on that very same false dichotomy.
I want to welcome you to Creation Radio and TV. I'm your host, Mike Riddle. And we're about to embark on a 5-part series that talks about the evidence for the existence of God. Now, as we get started, I'd like to begin with 2 of the main evidences people use against coming to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And the first one is the argument about morality, absolutes. And the argument goes like this: if you call God good and all-powerful, then why does he allow for evil and suffering to exist?
That's called the problem of evil, not the argument about morality. Absolutes. It's not a clincher, especially if you don't first assume that God actually wants what's best for everybody, as is made very clear in the Bible, but it is a pretty big one if you actually think that God loves us and wants what's best for us.
That is one of the main arguments people use for accepting Jesus Christ.
You mean against accepting Jesus, right? I think you need to find a more charismatic spokesperson if you want to get your message across.
And the second argument is, show me any evidence that God really does exist.
That's not an argument, that's a request. Show me the evidence, then I will analyze the evidence to see if it holds up to scrutiny, and then if I don't agree that it does hold up to scrutiny, I will provide my reasons why I think it is lacking, which might then be called arguments. The request for evidence itself is not an argument, it's an honest inquiry with the goal of better understanding reality.
For example, who made God? Where did God come from? You Christians are always invoking some magical entity to explain all your evidence.
Those are all valid questions and statements. Though not all Christians invoke magic to explain the evidence. The scientifically minded ones will usually be honest about the fact that you can't prove that there is a God, they have faith based on personal experience, and they don't expect others to take their word for it. An excellent example of this is episode number 355 of Dogma Debate with David Smalley, where David talks to Dr. Paul Rimmer, who has a PhD in physics from Ohio State University and is currently working at Cambridge studying abiogenesis. He is also a very devout Christian, and he does not invoke magic when studying abiogenesis. He marvels at the wonders of how God chose to work through natural means.
Or, I can't believe in something I can't see.
What if we stop believing again? If I can't see you...
Hey, slow down, slow down. You tell me you stop believing in the moon when the sun comes up.
No.
Okay, well, do you stop believing in the sun when clouds block it out?
No.
That is exactly why I don't believe in Australia. Or air. Or my kids when they're at my mother's house for the weekend. That's just a goofy thing to say, and I question the intelligence of anyone who actually thinks that not being able to see something is a good reason to doubt that thing's existence. I think what you mean to say there is that there is no evidence of God interacting in any way with the observable universe. So maybe you meant detect? I don't believe in God because God doesn't do anything detectable in the universe. That's a bit better.
These are two of the main reasons people deny the existence of God or deny coming to a personal relationship with Jesus Christ.
Okay, so let's just see if I have this right. People deny God because A, evil exists, so God can't be good, at least not if you want him to be all-powerful and all-knowing as well as good, and B, there's no evidence for God. Personally, I would have swapped those, as the evidence is far more important than what his alleged character is. I mean, call him good, bad, or indifferent all day if you like. If you can't demonstrate that he's actually there, it makes no difference to me.
Absolute morality and does God exist?
So wait, you summarize the problem of evil as absolute morality, and a request for evidence as the question, does God exist? Do you know how to word good?
Well, I'd like to give us 3 cautions. As Christians, we have 3 cautions here. We do not need to prove that God exists.
If you want me to believe in him, you do.
That is a fact. That is part of our biblical worldview as Christians, the fact of God. Secondly, as Christians, we should not require evidence for a belief in a creator God.
So if we shouldn't require evidence for belief in God, then why do you have a 5-part series called The Evidence for the Existence of God? That also is a pretty good summary of why the religious mindset is counterproductive. No need to think about any of this, just believe it. Shun anything that disagrees. Vote for science deniers. Stop sex education. Women are second-class citizens. The Bible makes all of this perfectly clear, so don't think about it, just act on it. This also goes a long way to explain why creationists don't put forth any of their own research. They just quote mine small bits that appear to superficially agree with them, and then discard the rest as not observable.
His word should be our authority in all matters. And third, it is not that we should not use evidence. Sometimes evidence can be very useful in helping non-believers understand. The point is, we should not use evidence in such a manner that it puts God on trial. However, in all cases, we should always be ready with an answer or defense. That comes right out of 1 Peter 3:15, where it commands us as Christians to have a ready defense for the hope that's within us.
So you shouldn't need evidence to believe, but you should be able to provide evidence that affirms your beliefs should someone ask you for it. That's kind of a roundabout way of saying, yeah, you actually do need evidence to believe.
Now, as we get started, a good question to ask a non-believer might go like this. Is it impossible for the God of the Bible to exist?
If you take the Bible literally, then yes. God has too many contradictory characteristics. God, as defined in the Bible, is love incarnate. He is love. Not just he has love, he is love. Yet there is also a list of things that God hates in Proverbs. The best part about this list is that God is guilty of at least 6 of the things on the list, and I'm assuming for argument's sake that God doesn't have haughty eyes. Though he is quite haughty himself, I don't recall any verses mentioning his eyes being haughty, so we can grant him that one. So starting with number 2, God lied on multiple occasions, usually indirectly by sending evil and lying spirits into the mouths of prophets, but also directly on occasion. 3, God has shed innocent blood himself and has ordered it to be shed multiple times. 4, his scheme of salvation could be said to be wicked, requiring animal sacrifice for thousands of years, followed by human sacrifice as payment for forgiveness instead of, just choosing to forgive, as he certainly could do if he really is all-powerful. Not to mention the plagues of Egypt, where he actively hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he could show off his power instead of softening his heart so the Israelites could go free without bloodshed. And of course the flood, where he killed the entire world's population by painful drowning when he had the power to painlessly just blink them all out of existence. I could go on. Number 5, feet that are quick to rush into evil. Well, God often does evil things, especially when he is angry, and even though he is described as slow to anger, it also says that his wrath can flare up in a moment. God definitely created evil. Does it make it better if he did it slowly? Number 6, a false witness who pours out lies. Well, I already showed a few examples of God lying, but for false witness, how about Ezekiel 20:25 through 26, where God gives people laws for them to follow that are actually bad laws and will give him an excuse to make them desolate? He lied to these people to tell them what they should do, then he used them doing those things as an excuse for him to punish them. Seems like the ultimate false witness, with God being both the witness and the judge. And finally, number 7, a person who stirs up conflict in the community. Well, there were times when God made people eat their own children. That's conflict if I ever did see it. Not to mention the time when Jesus said he came to turn families against themselves. That's pretty conflicting right there. So just going off this list of character traits that God hates, we can say that the God of the literal reading of the Bible cannot exist, as he has most, if not all, of the character traits that he hates. So God, who is love incarnate, not only hates, which is contradictory in itself, but he hates himself. So my answer is yes, it is impossible for the God of the Bible to exist as depicted by the Bible.
Well, they have 2 responses, yes and no. If they answer yes to that, then we can ask them, how do you know that is impossible? Do you know everything?
No, I don't know everything. But I know enough about the Bible to see that it gives God contradictory characteristics, so the God as laid out in the Bible is itself a logical contradiction, so it doesn't exist. You don't need to know everything in order to know that something cannot be the essence of love and yet have a list of things that it hates and also perform most if not all of the actions on the list of things that it hates. And that's only one aspect of God's contradictory nature. There are others. Maybe I'll do a standalone video on that at some point, but that's not what this one's about, so let's move on.
But if they answer no, then there is a possibility in their worldview that God could exist.
Yes, because I don't know everything, I will admit that there is a slight possibility that a God of some kind exists. But as stated before, that God cannot be the God of the Bible because of what the Bible says about him.
Now, in this first session, dealing with the evidence for the existence of God, we're going to cover cosmology, or the cosmological argument for the existence of God. Now, as Christians, we will start with our worldview. We will begin with this premise. God is a self-existing eternal being. He has no beginning and no end.
That's quite the premise you've got there. Are you going to provide evidence to support that premise, or is that just one of those truths with a capital T that it's heresy to question?
We maintain this assertion because it agrees with all reality.
How do you figure? I know of nothing in reality that is expected to have an eternal existence based on any evidence, so there better be some damn good evidence to support the idea that something could have an eternal existence and that it matches up with reality.
It is both a logical and a scientific explanation. It agrees with the fact that the universe does exist. It agrees that we have mass and energy. It agrees with our laws of science, our laws of logic and morality and all truth.
How does any of that suggest that something could be eternal? All the evidence points to the fact that nothing is eternal, and all this evidence somehow is in agreement with an eternal God?
So our biblical worldview starts this way. God does exist, and his word is true. That is the basic premise or presupposition all Christians should have.
Okay, but the series is called The Evidence for the Existence of God. Is it directed at Christians who already accept that the Christian God exists? I thought the whole point of this video series was to convince unbelievers that you picked the right God out of the millions of options, but that's going to be hard to accomplish if the main premise of the series is, I'm right and everyone else is wrong, my book is right, and nothing anyone ever says will change my mind.
Without this as our starting point, we really have no argument against the non-believer.
So if you don't start with, I'm right no matter what, then you have no argument against non-belief? Doesn't that make your position a little bit weak? That, to me, looks like an admission that there is no evidence for God because you can't even start the discussion until you assume not only that a God exists, but that it is your God. Imagine if science worked that way. We know that spontaneous generation is where maggots come from. That's true. Can't be wrong. What's that? Louis Pasteur's experiment showed that spontaneous generation didn't happen if you sterilize an isolated sample? Well, now we need to invent explanations for why spontaneous generation is still true, even though the data demonstrates the opposite. And now millions of people have died because of the barbers shaving people with the same razors they used to perform bloodletting procedures without washing them in between.
What on earth are you doing to this poor man?
What the hell does it look like? I'm bleeding it.
It's barbers.
It's got nothing to do with barbering.
People die when you assume conclusions, Mike.
Because this argument that God does exist and His Word is true is the foundation for all that we believe. It is the very foundation for the truth of His Word, the Bible.
That's not an argument, that's an assumption.
So let's begin with the cosmological argument, and it starts this way. How did the universe begin?
Well, we don't quite know, but we have a working model in the Big Bang Theory that fits very well with what we observe in the universe. This theory doesn't explain the whole origin of the universe, but it gets us very, very close to the beginning, and scientists are working every day to get us a little bit closer, with the goal of eventually discovering how the universe began. Assuming it did begin, it is a possibility that the universe has existed in one form or another for an eternity, but there really isn't any evidence to suggest that. We just haven't removed that option from the table yet, not to my knowledge anyway.
What a question that is. How did the universe begin? Now, we're not talking about the Big Bang, because a lot of non-believers will start with the Big Bang, but we can't start there. Because what we're talking about is, where did the matter come from to create the Big Bang?
Before the expansion, the universe was likely made up of pure energy. During the expansion, this energy would have been converted into particles and antiparticles, which would annihilate each other in a flash of light. But for every 10 billion antiparticles that form, 10 billion and 1 particles formed. So in the end, some matter was left over and eventually became the universe as we know it. Why were particles favored over antiparticles? Well, nobody knows for sure yet, but there are some hypotheses about it. One idea is that the Higgs field, which is the field that gives mass to other particles, would have had a much higher average strength during inflation, which would have decreased as the universe's expansion slowed down. This stronger field strength during the expansion period would have made the creation of antiparticles take just a little bit more energy than that of particles, resulting in the lopsided universe full of matter and lacking in antimatter that we see today.
Because you cannot have a Big Bang if there's not something there to go bang to start it all with.
And we aren't quite sure how that something got there, therefore the Christian God did it. Not just a God did it, but my God did it. Doesn't matter that the Bible doesn't say anything accurate about the Big Bang, which we are pretty confident actually happened. I mean, the closest you can come to saying the Bible agrees with the Big Bang is that God said, "Let there be light," and there would have been a lot of light during the initial expansion as all the matter and antimatter kept colliding. But that's only possible if you take it extremely metaphorically, as the Earth already existed when God created light, and creationists generally don't do well at taking Genesis metaphorically.
Now, there are only 3 possibilities to answer this question. Where did the matter come from to create this universe? Possibility number 1, the universe created itself.
What do you even mean by that? Is that your straw man of the non-creationist point of view, that the universe was just sitting there and one day decided to pop into existence? Nobody thinks that.
That would indicate the universe had a beginning. Possibility number 2, the universe has always existed. That would indicate there was no beginning.
So when you say the universe created itself, you just really mean that at some point the universe began. Okay, I could agree with that, but you could have worded it in a less confusing way.
And the third possibility is there had to be a creator, which means there was a beginning.
Fourth possibility, the universe came from a white hole that is the final destination of matter that falls into the black hole of another universe. I actually think you're overcomplicating this. You could have just said there are 2 options. Either the universe began at some point, or it has always been here. There are multiple subcategories for each of these options, such as the black hole seepage thing, God done it, it popped out of nowhere for reasons as yet unexplained, or a tiny subatomic speck of energy just has always existed and something happened to cause it to expand at one point. Or when you compress the universe that much, time itself breaks down, and so time came into existence as the universe expanded, meaning that time itself began with the universe, and so this speck of energy has always been there, but always is meaningless because time didn't exist until it expanded. All of these things are very difficult to wrap our little monkey brains around, except of course for God done it. The only problem there is that it doesn't have any explanatory power. If God done it, how'd he done do it? What mechanism did he use? Well, to answer that question, we would have to look at the evidence. And wouldn't you know it, the evidence points to the Big Bang. So God done it isn't really an explanation of anything, it's just a relatively useless assertion about something completely unmeasurable and unfalsifiable outside of reality.
So those are the only 3 options we have. And we'll start with option 1 here. The universe created itself. Now in this scenario, our starting point is nothing. No space, no time, matter, energy. Now, we will ask this question. What was the cause that brought it into existence? In order for something to create itself, it would have to have the power and energy to call itself into existence. But since nothing exists, there can be no source of energy for a first cause. In addition, since nothing exists, there's no space to call herself into existence. See, that's just good logic and science.
Okay, but the same can be said of God. Creationists often complain about panspermia, the idea that life, or at least its building blocks, may have originated somewhere other than Earth, and how it doesn't answer the question of life's origin, it just pushes it back a step. Well, if you say God done it, that doesn't answer the question of ultimate origin, it just pushes it back to God. Where did God come from? Did he just create himself out of nothing? Well, if there was nothing there, where did he get the energy to create himself?
To create yourself, you have to have the power to create yourself. But if you don't exist, you have no power or energy.
Good point. So God couldn't have created himself out of nothing either.
Now, John Warwick Montgomery, a PhD in theology and also a doctorate of law, makes this statement. Nothing in this world is able to explain its own existence. Thus, there must be a God in order to explain the world in which we find ourselves.
Is God able to explain his own existence? Because I would like to hear that explanation. Also, when discussing the cosmology of the very early universe, it's always good to have experts on your side, like people with doctorates in relevant areas of study, like theology and law. Nothing says, I understand how the quantum physics of the expansion period of the first fractions of a second of the universe, like doctorates in law and theology. Stephen Hawking? Who was that guy? He only had a BA in natural science and a PhD in applied mathematics and theoretical physics, specializing in general relativity and cosmology. He didn't think you needed God to explain the existence of the universe, but what does he know? It's not like he studied law or theology.
Now, Steve Coomer, PhD in philosophy, in his book, Christianity for Skeptics, makes this statement. If God is the cause of the universe, then he must be beyond and greater than the physical dimension. Therefore, we may discover the effects or evidence of God in the universe, but not necessarily observe the essence of God within the universe, for the profound reason that he transcends space, time, and matter.
Okay, that's all fine and good, but what are the effects or evidence of God of which you speak? Because without them, you may as well say that God just doesn't exist.
Now let's turn to option number 2. The universe has always existed. 3 things we need to consider about that statement. Number 1, if the universe has always existed, meaning no beginning, then it would be an infinite number of years old.
Okay, like I pointed out earlier, time would have gotten a little wonky when it was compressed into a subatomic dot, but close enough for now.
Continue.
What does it mean to be an infinite number of years old? Well, that would mean time without end, Latin for boundless. In mathematics, it means this: existing beyond or being greater than any arbitrary number. In other words, older than 1 trillion years.
I take issue with that definition. What's your source on that? That sounds more like a colloquial definition than a mathematical one. In mathematics, infinity is not necessarily larger than any arbitrary number, and there are multiple infinities. Some infinities are actually bigger than others. For instance, in between the integers 1 and 2 are an infinite number of fractions. But all of these infinite fractions are smaller than 2. So it's not bigger than the arbitrary number 2, it's smaller than the arbitrary number 2. And the infinite number of fractions between 1 and 2 all fit within the infinite number of fractions between 0 and 3. So the infinity contained between 1 and 2 is a smaller infinity than the infinity contained between 0 and 3. Infinity is a complex topic.
So that's what it means to be an infinite number of years old.
No, that's what it means to be greater than 1 trillion years old. To be an infinite number of years old would definitely include being older than 1 trillion, but that's not all there is to it. Oh, who cares anyway? Make your point already.
Now, 2, we need to consider the second law of thermodynamics. Now, to help us understand the second law of thermodynamics, I'd like to start with a definition and then give an illustration.
I think I see where this is going. If the universe is an infinite number of years old, then we would be at a state of maximum entropy by now, right? Never mind that funny things happen to spacetime when gravity gets involved, and there would be a massive amount of gravity present if the universe was compressed into a tiny dot. My understanding, which is admittedly very limited, is that the closer you get to a massive gravity source like a black hole, the slower time moves for you. So compress the universe into a dot, and perhaps the amount of time that's needed to pass before it expands into a universe with time as we know it, was close enough to infinity as to make no real difference. Of course, if you could be outside this dot in normal spacetime, it would look almost instantaneous, but within the dot, time would be moving very slowly. But this is just my armchair cosmology and does not necessarily reflect on what theoretical physicists think of the early universe. My point here is that it's more complicated than just a simple, if it were really old, there would be nothing left. This one's running a bit long, so I'll cut it off there for now. There's more fun to be had with this, though, so look out for part 2. Remember to follow me on Twitter and Facebook and support me on Patreon. See you next time!